Welcome, everyone. We are very excited to have a critical theory workshop book launch today with Zeyad El Nabolsy. We're going to both celebrate and discuss his very important publication, Paulin Hountondji and the Science Question in Africa. It is an excellent and timely publication that I think should be read widely. And one of the quotes that kind of stood out to me and I think helps frame the book to some extent is, this is on page 5, the point of the book is to show that African theorists who were working within the framework of historical materialism have made important contributions that can be deployed to help articulate the theoretical foundations of a sociology of scientific knowledge in the peripheries, end quote. So I'll ask Zeyad in a moment to self-introduce, and we are very pleased to be joined by Helena Sheehan, whom many people know, of course, is one of the leading theorists of the philosophy of science, working within the historical and dialectical materialist tradition. The format for today will be very simple. We've asked Zeyad to share a kind of framing of the book itself in order to situate ourselves in relationship to it. Helena has some prepared comments and a series of questions, and we'll engage in a dialogue around the book. And from there, we will then open up if there are questions from the general public. So Zeyad, with no further ado, thank you for joining us and sharing your important work with us. Why don't you briefly introduce yourself, and then you can go ahead and share your opening comments. Helena will share your self-introduction just prior to your comments, if that works for you. So Zeyad, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gabriel, for hosting this. I'm really honored to be here for the critical theory workshop, and I'm very honored to be in dialogue with Helena. I mean, anybody who's done any work on Marxism and the philosophy of science knows of her work, of course, really a touchstone contribution to Anglophone research on these questions. Just by way of a brief introduction, my name is Zeyad El Nabolsy. I'm an assistant professor in the philosophy department at York University. I work primarily on the history of African philosophy, as well as on Marxist philosophy, with a special focus on history and philosophy of science. A little bit of Hegel on the side, but those are, I guess, the three main areas. And especially the first two areas, I think, are the most relevant for the book. So maybe I'll just jump into the book and the project and, its conception. So the book is on a philosopher from Benin, Paulin Hountondji, who's really, very influential in African philosophy, both, of course, Francophone African philosophy. He was a Francophone philosopher, but also Anglophone African philosophy. And he's particularly known for his critique of ethnophilosophy, which was an approach to philosophy using ethnographic means, if you will. So going and trying to describe a worldview that prevails amongst the particular people and presenting it as philosophy. So people who talk about the Bantu conception of time, the Bantu conception of space, and so on. So he's well known for a very severe critique of this approach, which I won't really go into, but there is a particular element of it that I think explains kind of his later trajectory, which is what I'm interested in and its relevance today. Namely, one of the things he points out about ethnophilosophy is that it's what he calls an extroverted discourse. And the concept of extroversion is very important for Paulin Hountondji. So extroversion, he talks about extroverted discourses, so discourses that are directed towards the other, discourses that are determined externally in some way. And the concept of extroversion, of course, is widely deployed in some approaches to dependency theory. So we see it, for example, in the work of Samir Amin. And I'll talk a little bit about the connection between Samir Amin and Paulin Hountondji. So, for example, when people will talk about people like Samir Amin will talk about extroverted or disarticulated economies when they're talking about neo-colonial economies. And to talk about an extroverted economy is really to say that this economy is primarily responsive to and shaped by external demands, by the demands of another external economy, in many cases a former colony, if we're talking about parts of West Africa that were formerly colonized by France. And interestingly, Paulin Hountondji is, trained as a philosopher. He does kind of his doctoral work in the 1960s on Edmund Husserl. But I'm interested in his later turn. So in the 1980s, 1990s onwards, he starts talking about the fate of science on the African continent. Uh, and already you see it in his early work that he's interested in this because of the way he understands philosophy. So he thinks of philosophy primarily as a theory of science, a kind of second order discourse on science. Um, and this, of course, is something that you see in people who he was influenced by, people like Louis Althusser, people like Edmund Husserl. But of course, it's a very strong component of the Marxist tradition in general to think of philosophy as a kind of second order reflection on science. So think of Engels' work, for instance. Really, it's um, this approach to philosophy and this claim that philosophy should abandon its pretensions to kind of describe ultimate reality or something like that independently of the empirical sciences. I think this is something you see in a lot of Marxist writers from the 19th and 20th centuries. Now, it's interesting and very interesting that there is, in my view, at least as I try to argue in the book, a very clear historical materialist thrust to Paulin Hountondji's work. Um, and interestingly enough, in the reception of Paulin Hountondji, this is not really discussed very frequently. It's sometimes elided, really. Even though it really is the pivot of his work, this claim that, look, philosophy does not have an autonomous history, uh, and he tries to draw these connections between causal connections between philosophy and a certain mode of production, society dominated by a certain mode of production, by way of using uh, technology as a kind of intermediary link. So I mean, to put it very simplistically, if we have a multi-layered approach, you could say, look, productive forces slash technology, you get science, you get philosophy. So you get a kind of causal chain there. I mean, it's much more complicated than that, but I think that's a good starting point. But what's really interesting is that I think Hountondji does something quite different from what a lot of people do because the basic premise of this book really is we can reconstruct his theory as a synthesis between some version of a Marxist theory of science, but taking that and applying it to a colonial and a neo-colonial context. Um, Through looking at what would dependency theory say about how, for example, capitalism hinders the development of productive forces in the periphery, in the colonized country and the country under new colonial conditions. Because the idea, to put it very simply, is that if at the end of the day the development of something like modern science is contingent on the development of modern technology or the kind of technology that was developed in early modern Europe, then you could say that insofar as capitalism retards or places obstacles in the development of productive forces in the periphery, then capitalism actually operates as a retarding force on the development of modern science in the periphery. And here it's quite interesting because this is very different from a view of colonialism as a kind of civilizing mission. I mean, one of the things I try to do in the book too is to show that um, in many cases, what the people today who label themselves as decolonial theorists say about the relationship between modern science and colonialism and capitalism is actually not true. Because there is a strand in decolonial thought which you can detect, which goes something like this. Again, being very simplistic, just for the sake of brevity, but it goes something like this. Look, one of the things that colonial officials tried to do was they tried to impose a different way of understanding the world on Africans. I'm focused on the African case, right? And they tried to developed the civilizing project based on assimilation, so taking them to study in French schools and so on. But actually, the historical record shows that in most cases, the people who were demanding access to an education in the modern sciences were Africans. And the people who were opposed to it were colonial officials or white Europeans, if we're talking about a situation where it's a settler colony. So actually, the entire decolonial framing is based, I think, on a historical misunderstanding. I mean, we can try to explain why this is the case because, you can think about um, the kind of basic case studies for decolonial theory were actually Latin American case studies. So I think there is also a kind of foisting of the Latin American context on the African context. But this is, will take us further afield. But one of the things I'm really interested in the book is how come Paulin Hountondji um, is trying to basically disentangle the association between modern science and colonialism or Western domination in general. So, one of, I think, the key distinctions that he makes and that I try to reconstruct is a distinction between modern science and Western science. So, to say that modern science is Western science, you could take that in many ways. So, one way people will speak of it is it's basically a continuation of a kind of intellectual discourse that has its origins in, for example, ancient Greece. And so we have the history of Western science. But actually, if you think about what's happening, I think for Paulin Hountondji, there is a very clear distinction between modern science and Western science, insofar as that modern science, and here really he's taking Galileo's early Galileo's mechanics as the kind of paradigm, if you will. And if you think about what's happening there, is he's saying, well, look, actually, given this kind of mathematizing approach to understanding reality, you can posit a very significant discontinuity between so-called Western ancient science, ancient Greek science, and early modern science. And actually, the key contrast for him is not between Western science and non-Western science. It's between modern science and ancient Greek science, medieval science, Arabic science, Babylonian science, Sanskrit science, right? Anything you could. So actually, he kind of breaks away, and here is where I think the historical materialism is important, because I would say that from a historical materialist standpoint, the use of something like Western civilization as an analytic category is in fact illegitimate. What we're trying to do is we're trying to understand societies based on um, the dominant mode of production in those societies. We are not committed to the claim that there is some kind of cultural essence which is expressing itself uh, 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 in these different social formations and which somehow remains the same despite tremendous breaks in terms of the kind of dominant relations of production and so on in a given society. So I think in that sense too, we also get an account of Eurocentrism that's much closer, really, to how Eurocentrism was conceived by the person who kind of, he didn't coin the term, but he helped popularize it, Samir Amin, in his book, Eurocentrism. Where actually, if you think about what's happening there, Samir Amin doesn't think that the claim that X was first discovered in Europe is Eurocentric by itself. If assuming it's the case that X was first discovered in Europe, whatever X may be. But he thinks that Eurocentrism is primarily a phenomena that happens at the level of explanation. When we try to say, well, actually, the reason X was first discovered in some Western European society is because of some European intellectual essence, of some unique European spirit. So I think this is very interesting because uh, in a lot of contemporary debates in African philosophy, um, people use Eurocentrism in a very kind of wide-ranging sense, which I think, we lose any kind of distinctness, and it maybe sometimes forces people to commit to claims that they wouldn't want to commit to claims that aren't backed by empirical evidence. Um, and really, I think the importance of this book is that I think Paulin Hountondji keeps alive a spirit of optimism, which was dominant in the 1960s on the African continent. This kind of spirit of optimism that said, well, look, we're going to be able to catch up with the West. And because we're going to be able to catch up with the West, we don't really have to take a very defensive attitude towards our own indigenous modes of intellectual inquiry. Um, and you'll see actually in this period, lots of people are engaged in critical analysis of uh, different modes of intellectual inquiry that were dominant in the society, whether it be in medicine, in astronomy, anything, right? But something happens in the 1980s, and this is where the kind of sociology of knowledge comes into play, I think. Something happens in the 1980s where it becomes clear by that point that there is no catching up happening anytime soon. And then, for a variety of reasons, but the main reason really that this is happening is this is also the period where you get structural adjustment. So it means that all of these attempts at creating uh, autonomous scientific research institutions, which Hountondji is a champion of, and really it's one of the things that he really writes for, if you will. All of these attempts have been undermined systematically. Um, and so by that point, really, people start, I think, redescribing failures as successes. So you'll start seeing people saying, well, actually, maybe we don't need any kind of modern research in oncology. What we're gonna do is we're going to turn to what people would call traditional medicine. But I think this is essentially to be explained by this defeat at the material level, at the level of state planning and so on. I think it's important to keep this in mind. Um, and I'm just going to conclude because I really want to hear Helena's questions and comments. But I'm just going to conclude by saying that uh, I think one of the really interesting things in Hountondji's, Marxist approach, and I think it was Helena who pointed this out in her important work on Marxism and the philosophy of science, which is that the Marxist or historical materialist approach takes it to be the case that there is social determination operative in the sphere of scientific discourse, but it doesn't take it to be the case that social determination by itself is sufficient to contaminate scientific discourse. It actually depends on the type of social determination that's operating. So this is how we can get something like a very sociologically and historically oriented account in Paulin Hountondji's work of science without it being taken to be an attempt at debunking well-established scientific theories. So I think this is really important that sets him apart from, kind of more relativistic approaches. Um, and I'm just going to, I think we said 15 minutes. I think this has been 15 minutes, and maybe hand it over to Helena.
Well, thank you so much, Zia. That was a very helpful framing of the book. Helena Sheehan, of course, many people know, and if you don't, then you should quickly explore her work because she's one of the leading theorists of philosophy of science and historical and dialectical materialism in general, and also a practitioner in the sense that she's dedicated to making a better world, not simply interpreting it. But Helena, maybe you could say a brief or provide a kind of brief introduction for people who might not be familiar with your work, and then share with us the comments and questions that you have regarding this important book project that just came out.
Okay, thank you. I describe myself as an author, academic, and activist, three A's. Um, in terms of my academic position, I'm an emeritus professor at Dublin City University, visiting professor at Peking University, and I have been a visiting professor at University of Cape Town. I've been active on the left for decades now, and still going at it. And in terms of my publications, lots of 6 books, lots of articles on not only on philosophy and science, but culture and politics. I believe in the idea of philosophy as a worldview, and so it's a way into thinking about everything. And at one point or other, I've had something to say about almost everything, thinking it through philosophically. So oh, and in terms of my books, I guess the most relevant ones to the topic here are obviously my one on Marxism and the philosophy of science. And then I guess my last two, Navigating the Zeitgeist and Until We Fall. And I'll come back briefly to that. So it's very interesting. Well, first of all, the book and the presentation of the book just now by Ziyad is very, very clear and informative and important. And it's interesting for me to participate in this because it brings together my interests in science studies and African studies. And much of my engagement with Africa and African studies has not been about science, to my disappointment, much of the time. It's been focused on politics, culture, history, and historiography. And it was a constant source of disappointment to find a kind of lack of engagement with science in African studies, specifically the lack of traction for a Marxist philosophy of science. So I'm delighted to have it here. So in engaging with African studies, I found either a negative attitude to science and various forms of Africanism, or an uncritical embrace of mainstream positivist approaches to science, especially in Africa's post-colonial integration into the global university system. So through all this, I was aware of Hountondji's approach in embodying a different position. But to be honest, I was a bit put off by his being labeled as Althusserian. And I've always found the Althusserian approach to science to be abstract, sclerotic, and very distant from actual science, and having the effect of obscuring far more than it clarifies. And my basic criterion for anything is, does this clarify the terrain or does it muddy the pitch? And Althusser always came out on the wrong side of this, as far as I was concerned. And one aspect of Althusser's approach that Ziyad emphasizes in this book, this idea that philosophy is parasitic on science, which I don't think is well conceptualized. Certainly, philosophy is dependent on science, but in contrast, for example, to somebody like Bernal, who has a real connection to real science, and there's this organic flow, this interactionist way of conceptualizing the relationship between philosophy and science, that I find much more clarifying and productive for science as well as philosophy. Now, Ziyad in this book does note, and I see him nodding when I'm talking about Althusser here, notes that Althusser at one point, I remember reading this myself, Althusser notes, admitted his lack of knowledge of the history of science and even the history of philosophy, and worried that he might be exposed as a trickster he was, which I saw as a moment of truth. And I wish the Althusserians had taken at least these few sentences more seriously. But I think that Hountondji has transcended the Althusserian influence to a considerable degree, and Ziyad in his book, I think makes a good case for how he's done this. And I think that he's offered a constructive approach to conceptualizing science and its relationship to modernity, to capitalism, to colonialism, to Africa. And I think that Ziyad lays all this out very well in this book. So I want to give my thoughts on a few important themes in this book. First of all, the whole cluster of basic questions about knowledge production, focusing on the relationships and distinctions between modernity, modern science, capitalism, colonialism. Although they came into being at the same time, in the same process, this does not mean that they're the same thing or inseparable. And I think this book takes great care to untangle these tangled strands. Now, a key point in this, and Ziyad just mentioned this in his opening remarks, and it's a point I make a lot of myself, and Hountondji, his affirmation of the core feature of historical materialism on science, that the social process by which science emerged does not necessarily settle the issue of its value as knowledge. The social determinism does not contaminate knowledge. In fact, it's a condition of knowledge because we only encounter nature in socially mediated forms. And there's no getting around that. So in my own work, I've stressed this is the core feature of the Marxist philosophy of science, the whole Marxist, philosophy and sociology of science, that sets it apart from all of the alternatives. Both a strong affirmation of the socio-historical constitution of science and the cognitive capacity of science to produce reliable knowledge. Because otherwise, in the case of Africa, the repudiation of colonialism would fence off science as the domain of the colonizer and exclude Africa from the whole global process of advancing knowledge. So, as Zeyad has emphasized in the book, that the kind of relativism that this entails might intend to be an intellectual revolt against colonialism and imperialism, but it actually surrenders to the state of affairs that colonialism and imperialism have brought about. Which is a really important point made in this book, and excludes Africa from the whole global process of advancing knowledge, which is utterly unacceptable. So a key point is that the critique of colonization and the whole process of decolonization does not necessarily involve renunciation of modern science. Nevertheless, it does not mean accepting modern science and the dominant modes of knowledge production of science uncritically. Both of these are key points. So the critique, there are alternative paths. I mean, what I'm saying is that colonization and the process of decolonization really does necessitate a process of the decolonization of knowledge. And the whole Africanist agenda is right on this. But there are alternative paths in the decolonization of knowledge. One is ethnophilosophy, as Zeyad has explained. This whole idea of African ways of knowing, of Afrocentrism, negritude, and the latest version of all of this is this postmodernized decoloniality. I hate the term decoloniality. It's just so pomo. I mean, decolonization is a strong, active term. And it's just a kind of word that's academic seminar. I know we're at an academic seminar here, but do you know what I mean? It doesn't feel like it has any traction on the street. So this cluster of converging approaches is often based on a prioritization of indigenous knowledge and a whole romanticization of primitive culture, along with this rejection of modern science. Then there's the alternative position, which is Hountondji's position, it's Zeyad's position in this book, it's my position, and that is like an affirmation of modernity, of science, of epistemological criteria as universal, while critical of colonization as hindering the development of productive forces, including knowledge production, including science in the colonized world. So contrary to the colonizers' claims to have brought development and knowledge to societies that could not achieve this themselves. Again, a strong emphasis in Hountondji and in Zeyad's book. So I'd like to reflect a bit on the contrary trend, the first trend, as I've encountered it in thinking my way through Africa. I've engaged with various forms of Africanism, such as Afrocentrism, which starts from the premise that the European conquest resulted not only in economic expropriation and political domination, but in epistemicide. It disrupted indigenous knowledge systems, and colonization extended even to consciousness. The antidote is decolonization of consciousness, beginning with a critique of Eurocentrism as claiming a false universality, as a view of the world from the point of view of the colonizer rather than the colonized. This much, I think, is undeniable. From here, the history of the world is then revised with a strong emphasis on the origins of the human species in Africa. Early African civilizations in Nubia and Zimbabwe, the devastation caused African cultures by the slave trade and colonization, the promise of liberation movements, the process of decolonization. Again, undeniable, undeniably important. Now, some versions look back to ancient Egypt, which they call Kemet, as a Black civilization, which was the source of culture and philosophy of ancient Greece. A lot of accusations of, Greece, ancient Greek philosophy, stealing it from Egypt. And Martin Bernal's book, Black Athena, was one text. I think a lot of it because it's the dramatic title, which was thought of by the publisher, not by Martin Bernal, actually. But it was one text around which a lot of this controversy swirled. But from here, it goes in diverse directions. One stream advocates a delinking from European thought and culture and a return to African purity and primordiality. It sees Africa as the source of a superior human essence. In essentialist terms, it sees Black people as warm, holistic, communal, spiritual, cosmological, connected to land and ancestors, and whites as cold, fragmented, individualist, empiricist, acquisitive, oppressive. Now, it's striking to me that there's some discourses in which females and males are contrasted in a similar way, or Irish and English have been conceived in these kind of parallel essentialist terms. And these there are other movements in the last decades have also embraced this kind of return to source and this glorification of primordiality. In Ireland, we have advocates of Celtic spirituality and Gaelic goddesses. There are many other examples, and you can see trends like this in contemporary ecology as well. This whole idea of glorification of primitive culture and people living at one with the land, and it's all about beautiful sunsets and not about storms, famines, disease, early death, tribal rivalry, and a lot of the more brutal realities of primitive life. So I found this trend, in this particular trend in Africanism, a lot stronger in the African diaspora than I actually found it when I was in Africa, interestingly, but it does have some traction in Africa. And a much cited proponent of a fairly extreme version of this is Malefikete Asante at Temple University there in Philadelphia. By the way, born Arthur Lee Smith in Georgia. So in 2000, I attended an Afrocentrist conference in Philadelphia where Asante entered wearing a robe of kente cloth and a gold crown and scepter because he had had himself installed as a king in Ghana. And many speakers at this conference got up and announced that they were descendants of pharaohs, nobles, aristocrats. And by the way, this the same time I was in Philadelphia that year, a few days later than that, there was this Million Family March in Washington, where speakers took the same line, arguing that they were the descendants not of slaves, but of kings and queens. But anyway, at the conference, they continued in that vein, calling upon divinity, identifying with monarchy, asserting a pure African essence, denouncing the influence of foreign thought systems, including Marxism. At one point, a speaker said, "Are there any Marxists here?" I raised my hand as if it wasn't already difficult enough being white, as admitting that without admitting that I was a Marxist. They were very polite to me on a personal level, but it was rather uncomfortable. And also there was promotion of a pilgrimage led by Asante to Kemet in Ghana, And these returns to source, by the way, were in jet planes, air-conditioned buses, and five-star hotels, with prices that clearly excluded the descendants of slaves that were living in the neighborhood of Temple University. So I think it's important, to say, these difficult things to say. But at the same time, it's important to remember that Afrocentrism um, has come about as a movement rooted in the push for history from below, for a critique of Eurocentrism as a corrective to the racist and imperialist view of Africa. And there has been a need for a refocusing of perspective and a retelling of the story of the world that most of us learned in school. There has been a need to see the world, to try to see the world from Africa, and to transform the curriculum accordingly. However, there's much that's reactionary in this kind of brand of Afrocentrism. This preoccupation with pharaohs and pyramids and pageants, the identification with pharaohs rather than their slaves, that is, with the oppressor rather than the oppressed, which is a shocking thing for people who actually are the descendants of slaves and the oppressed of the earth. And this appeal to romanticized primordial past, the static, essentialized, homogenized view of African personality and thought processes. So, and also the emphasis on race to the neglect of class and gender, and the blindness of some of these trends to the economic realities and global structures of power. So, an alternative approach to the decolonization of knowledge is one that's represented by Hountondji. It involves a perspective that claims the right of Africans to actively participate in the construction of the universal, a really important point. It involves seeing the world from Africa and demanding that African academics position themselves in Africa, prioritize its problems, subject both exogenous and endogenous knowledge systems to critical scrutiny, to reconceptualize the world by reintegrating suppressed stories, by reimagining its emergent possibilities. And this book is definitely in that camp. And I think that Hountondji's application of dependency theory to the sociology of scientific knowledge is quite good in its analysis of the global flows of power and knowledge, and opposing the dominant view of capitalism as a force for development in the colonized world. Again, a strong point in this book and in Zeyad's presentation just now. Claiming that Hountondji claims that capitalism in the periphery lacked the internal dynamism of its development in the metropole and actually held back development in the periphery and held back scientific development. So there's much emphasis on how, in Hountondji, about how Africa was reduced to data for theory that would be developed elsewhere, and how he emphasized how important it is for Africa to be not only the source of data, but of theoretical production. So I think in this book and in Hountondji's work, there's a good analysis of the global division of labor, because there's been this systematic brain drain under capitalism, where, among other results of it, where high-achieving African scientists look to make their careers in the metropole. Or even when they stay in Africa, even when scientists from the global south play an increasing role in the process of data collection, they still frame their problems and answers accordingly. And they make the point that the vertical ties with the North are seen as more important than horizontal ties with the South. And this has to change. Actually, I think there are forces in motion that are changing this somewhat. I sense several things going on now. I sense a mood for greater global solidarity beyond and even against the metropole. I think the whole global reconfiguration of the geopolitical scenario with BRICS Plus and other such developments will have academic consequences. And I think there is something of a reverse brain drain underway, although much of this is not about progressive solidarity, but kind of forced on intellectuals by reactionary forces, and making a lot of intellectuals in the metropole now feel unsecure and welcome in these metropolitan centers, which, you know, for ages, these centers felt they could just buy the best brains in the world to their universities and research centers. I've seen this most dramatically recently, first with Brexit, and now with the Trump administration in the US. Many international academics who made their careers in the UK began to look for alternatives, and even many Brits began to scramble to get Irish passports. And in the US now, the atmosphere is so hostile to international academics that I think it's even going to be difficult for you to get international academics to come even to conferences in the kind of atmosphere that's developing now. And I'm really sorry for, you know, all the people whose lives are being disrupted by this. But on the other hand, globally, it could be a good thing for this brain drain, the existing patterns of knowledge flows to begin to reverse themselves. So I think that, you know, there does need to be a radical reshift in the geopolitics of knowledge production. So in my own engagement with Africa, I've been preoccupied with the impact of liberation movements when they come to power on this process of the decolonization of knowledge. And I've written about this in two places. One is a long article called Contradictory Transformations, Observations on the Intellectual Dynamics of South African Universities. And then the second is a long chapter in my most recent book, a long chapter on Africa in Until We Fall, that deals in a more autobiographical mode with my six intervals in Africa. So I went to South Africa to pursue what liberation meant in intellectual terms. And I focused on looking at the underlying assumptions that were shaping academic disciplines, the debates that were contesting them, and the whole existence of these social, political, economic movements that were encompassing them. And probing the impact of Marxism, Africanism, postmodernism, neoliberalism on the production of knowledge in South Africa. So what I found in piecing together a picture of the present was that I was constantly pushed back to the past, not only the past of the academy, but the past of the liberation movement. And to my surprise, and in great sadness, I found greater intellectual ferment in the liberation movement than in liberation, which it was a very hard thing for me to conceptualize and admit. So I traced the trajectories of philosophy, psychology, sociology, literature, political economy, history, and you know, I saw you know, when 1994 people who'd been working in these areas and active in the movement really felt that their time had come, because the whole decolonization of history had been a powerful force in the liberation movement. And, you know, whatever the government ministers and vice chancellors were declaring, and no matter how sincere, you know, and genuine were their struggle credentials, the nation was actually inserting itself into a global process where the systemic logic went in the direction of increasing commodification of knowledge and surrender to the exigencies of the market. And I concluded that South African universities were caught up in this complex field of forces, which I called contradictory transformations, with the one imperative being the agenda of the liberation movement and the other agenda being the global market. And both during my whole time there, they were both constantly in play in an interesting way. But at times it felt as if the first was being overpowered by the second. So, concluding, I just want to say my current preoccupation is also in this area of the process of knowledge production. I'm quite interested in what I call the contemporary crisis in meaning, which I think is a crisis in worldview. And I'm trying to articulate how this is generated by the capitalist mode of production in its decadent phase. Because I believe that only Marxism is capable of generating analysis of the cascading crises of our time and beginning to chart some kind of path beyond them. So I want to conclude by asking a few questions of Zayad about the book and about Hountondji. You say in the book that he considered himself a historical materialist, but not a Marxist. And I'd like you to expand on that and explain just, why and how that was. Related to that, I have a question. What were his politics? He seems to have been distant from actual political involvement, aside from his position as a period as a government minister. And his lifespan is roughly my lifespan. He was born a year before me and he died a year ago. So I've lived the years that he's lived. And during these years, there was so much ferment. I mean, so much left activity. And I wonder how, other than taking progressive positions as a professor, and then, as a government minister, how active was he in wider movements beyond academe, and how did he conceptualize this? And it's interesting to me that he was only in government after Benin abandoned the socialist path. I'd like to know more. What was his position on that government? That government, previous government, actually defined itself as Marxist. What was his relationship to that government? And so I'm very curious about what you know about that and how you think about that yourself. My third question is about his relationship with the whole Marxist tradition and philosophy of science. Especially, beyond Althusser, that I just consider as a blind alley in this, in this process. But I'm thinking of how familiar was he with the work of Bernal? And here I mean J.D. Bernal, not Martin Bernal. By the way, they were father and son. But Bernal and Haldane, Langevin, Joliot-Curie, Levins, Lewontin. Did he know did he know this tradition and how did he relate to it? So keen to hear what you have to say.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Helena. These are great questions, and I'm really excited to be in this conversation with you. And I just want to affirm, that I also share your distaste for the decoloniality stuff. I think we all share that distaste. But anyway, let me start with the questions, and maybe I'll comment on some of the other issues you raised quickly. So it's interesting to me that Paulin Hountondji himself isn't really politically active. And I mean, it's, so he's in France, for example, in 1968, and he gives this account as to why he didn't get involved. He says, well, I was primarily interested in African affairs, and while I was sympathetic to these movements in France in the 1960s, I wasn't really inclined to be directly involved, right? So I think he never really pretends to be an activist intellectual, right? And so with respect to the point about being a historical materialist but not a Marxist, I think it's interesting because so just conceptually independent of Paulin Hountondji, You could be a historical materialist just in the sense that you think, well, here is this explanatory paradigm that I think works and I'm going to use, but you might not have the political commitments associated with Marxism, right? So you might, and I don't want to say that Hountondji didn't have these commitments, but just making a conceptual point that you could think, for example, that class antagonisms have primacy in most cases vis-a-vis other forms of social antagonisms, but you could still be on the side of the ruling class, right? I mean, conceivably, that's possible for somebody to just be a purely descriptivist, Marxist, historical materialist, sorry. And I mean, it's interesting that I just remembered now when you posed this question, I remember reading about the reception of Marxist Capital in Japan, and in the first half and second half of the 20th century, um, in many cases, volume one of Capital was taught in kind of in just university classes as a description of how the system operates, but it was not tethered to a particular political commitment, which I think is a point in favor of Marx, actually not. But anyway, going back to Paulin Hountondji. So I think Paulin Hountondji, for example, had a very uh, distant and potentially you could say antagonistic relationship with um some of what people would call, actually existing socialism. And in particular, looking at the case in Benin, where you had a governing coalition that, as you pointed out, Helena, it labeled itself as Marxist-Leninist and was in power from the early 70s to 1990, where you get this national conference or convention uh, that leads to political transformation in a kind of more, you could say, I guess, liberal direction. Um, and he had this view that Marxist-Leninist discourse was being used purely opportunistically in Benin in those years, so from the early 1970s to the 1990s. And I think in part this is why he would kind of distance himself from that label. So was in part also a particular historical experience. Um, but I mean, in general, as I was saying, he's not really a political activist. Now, um, he doesn't really pretend to be a political activist, and he gets involved, as you're saying, in the 1990s, early 1990s, as a minister um, of education and culture, kind of in support of this transformation um, away from the People's Republic of Benin. So, in that sense, he's not really active, I think, in Marxist politics. That would be the very simple answer to your question, right? Now, you raised a very interesting question about this kind of Anglophone Marxist tradition in philosophy of science with people like Bernal and Haldan. And as far as I can tell, I've never seen any direct reference to them. And I also haven't seen any direct reference to Boris Hessen, for instance. But I think, I mean, some of the things he says, as I tried to show in the book, they're basically a restatement of the Hessen-Grossman thesis, of the thesis defended by Boris Hessen and Heinrich Grossman about the origins of early modern science. But I've never been able to see a direct influence of Bernal on him. So that would be something to think about for me in the future, but it could also be something that would have to be investigated through looking at the Francophone reception of Bernal and Haldan. And I don't know much about the Francophone reception of them, because primarily his interaction is through this kind of Francophone sphere. And I totally agree with you, Helena, on the question of Althusser. I mean, I think there is a very clear kind of Althusserian influence. I regard it as unfortunate in a sense, and I describe in the book how we can kind of rework this claim independently of Althusser's very schematic approach, because I agree with that labeling of the Althusserian approach. And Gabriel, do you have some time to comment on some of Helena's other comments?
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I just want to point out, I mean, this question of uh, um, potential transformations and the end of scientific dependency. because I think it's quite interesting to contrast, for example, the case of the African continent with a case of a country that has been able to end scientific and technological dependency. China, for example, would be a pretty obvious case, right? Uh, and there, it's interesting. I was just in China for a conference, and actually I was presenting something on the idea of a distinctly African way of knowing or mode of cognition, a kind of critical history of this idea. Um, and there were several Chinese academics there, and I think it's interesting because, of course, in the Chinese context, there is no abandonment of the investigation of the corpus of texts that has been inherited from the past, whether it be kind of in the realm of science or the realm of philosophy. But there is a very clear understanding that one has to integrate modern science and modern technology and institutionalize them. Otherwise, one will be totally dependent on the West. Um, and we've seen on the African continent some movements away from this. So, for example, South Africa's development of a vaccine during, the height of the pandemic, that was an interesting development. But other African countries were essentially um, in a position, in a very weak bargaining position, just essentially waiting for uh, uh, countries with better pharmaceutical industries to send them vaccines. So I think it really, I mean, um, it's not purely an academic issue, right? It really touches on people's lives. It's a very serious issue. And of course, we've been talking about pharmaceuticals, but you could talk about the defense industry, for example, and having the capacity to defend yourself or develop a deterrent. I mean, we're seeing how important that is today, right? Especially in the region of the Middle East. Um, so I really think it's not just an academic issue. There is a practical component here that's really important. I mean, as to the question of, or this issue of the impact of the liberation movements on the decolonization of science and knowledge in general, I think it's really interesting because, you know, the attitude that I find, for example, in the writings of people like Amilcar Cabral is essentially a critical attitude towards both what was presented to them as kind of the latest uh, uh, modern scientific discourse. So Cabral has a very critical attitude towards uh, uh, monocrop agriculture. He thinks actually it exhausts the soil and so on. So he doesn't just take what he's taught and defer to it, but he also has a very critical attitude towards some indigenous claims to knowledge about weather systems and so on, right? So I think this is basically, and here there, the criterion there is really a kind of pragmatic criterion, right? It's, well, I mean, if you follow this fundamentally false account of how weather systems work, you wouldn't be able to develop a military strategy, for example, in the context of guerrilla warfare, right? It's really, I mean, you could follow it, but you'll find very quickly that, you've made a mistake. So I think this kind of practical aspect is very important. And I think, even on the question of relativism, and when people say, well, look, you have different societies that have incommensurable epistemic standards, and I think a kind of more practical or even interventionist understanding of science gets you beyond that because you can see in the 19th century that when non-Europeans encountered the products of European technology, I mean, you could gloss that as applied science, but some qualifications, I think in some cases it's not applied science. But you could see very clearly they understood that, this kind of canon is able to deliver this kind of damage to my walls, right? This is something you can see. It has nothing to do, and it affects you directly. It has nothing to do with trying to argue your way out of it or something, or raising skeptical objections. So I think, this kind of interventionist understanding of science is very important to these issues. Um, and I really just want to reaffirm, the thing that Helena began with, which is we have to distinguish between modern science, capitalism, and colonialism, and modernity in general. Otherwise, we're really going to be uh, defending, archaic positions, anachronistic positions, um, and we're going to be infantilizing people. I think that's the key issue, right? When people say, well, look, this is an indigenous approach, we just have to celebrate it. I mean, this is really a very disrespectful approach. Nobody who you take seriously, if you take someone seriously, you wouldn't just treat them with this deference. Yeah, this total deference, you only treat a child with. Well, okay, this is a great idea or something. Uh, but if you take this, this interlocutor as a rational being, of course, you're trying to say, well, look, here is what you and I are trying to do cooperatively. Here is how it's not working. Here is how it's working. So I think really like the gesture of respect and the turning away from the Eurocentric legacy requires that we have a critical attitude, a critical, open-minded attitude. And I'll just stop there. And I just thank you, Elena, again for the engagement. This is really a great honor, and thank you, Gabriel, for hosting this. It's fantastic.
No, of course. Helena, if there's anything you'd like to say in immediate response, feel free and jump in.
Yeah,
Other,
just
go
yeah,
ahead, go
just
ahead.
a brief comment about the way various post-colonial African societies have dealt with traditional medicine. Um, because, for example, at one point I got to know Herbert Ishiwakunza, who was a doctor who was the first minister of health in Zimbabwe, and he met with traditional healers. And tried to find a way to incorporate what was of value there, as well as getting them on board with modern medicine and the health systems that Zimbabwe was trying to set up. And in South Africa, it's also been a big issue. I mean, I regularly ran into people who are Sangomas that were in the ANC and even in the party. Um, and South Africa's tried to be, as affirmative as possible about traditional medicine and traditional healers. But they've realized that this has to be subjected to modern epistemological criteria. And there's a lot of truth in it. I mean, certain herbs have certain healing properties. There are traditional practices that are valuable and should be allowed to thrive in a healthy interaction with the best of global medicine. But there are also certain things that are dangerous. And in South Africa, there's been a big problem with Muti murders, which was shocking. This belief that, certain body parts, particularly of babies, it can, be taken and used to heal certain diseases. And, that is illegal and enforced to the best of the ability of the government, but a serious problem. And, how to, I mean, it's the right approach to try to have this integrated approach, but can also sometimes be very complicated in practice. But I think that, African governments, when they came to power, made a real effort at this, as far as I know, which has been quite interesting.
Maybe just to facilitate the conversation, I'll share a question that I think could be responded to by both of you, and that is that it strikes me, Ziad, if I'm not mischaracterizing the book, that one of the central concerns is a kind of culturalist approach that would think in terms of there being a particular African way of thinking or African way of doing science or an essence to Africa. And this is juxtaposed to a historical materialist approach that begins with the overall global relations of production and the underdevelopment of Africa due to the history of colonialism and imperialism. And if we begin from that vantage point, then we situate science within its overall material relations as opposed to beginning with a culturalist, essentialist set of assumptions. Within that overall framework, I thought that it was interesting that you principally used the term historical materialism to refer to Hountondji's work, and that the concept of dialectical materialism wasn't very prevalent in the book. This has, of course, been important for a lot of Helena Sheehan's work. And given that there's a strong debate within Marxist circles concerning the relationship between the kind of natural sciences and the social sciences, or what some people refer to as dialectical materialism as applying to the natural world versus historical materialism focusing on culture and the social world, I was curious why you made that decision. Was it adhering more closely to Hountondji's own conceptualization of it? And in short, I even scanned through the book just out of curiosity to see if dialectics was a thematic, because what you're illustrating and what you're performing is a dialectical analysis that is demonstrating that the development of knowledge forms in Africa is relationally constituted out of its rapport to the colonial and imperialist forces that have had an impact on it. So I'm also just curious more generally how you think of your work or Hountondji's work more specifically in relationship not only to the dialectical materialist tradition, but dialectics kind of writ large.
Yeah, I mean that's a great question. One way to answer this is to say that I take debates about dialectical materialism to be debates about how should we interpret uh, claims made by fundamental physics and so on, right? About the ultimate nature of reality. And so to that extent, that's above my pay grade. So that would be right. But the serious answer would be, I think that historical materialism, uh, you know, it's not really dependent on the truth of dialectical materialism. I mean, I'm not really rejecting or affirming the truth of dialectical materialism. I just think it's independent because you could take the historical materialist approaches to say, look, if you want to study a society, including its intellectual productions and so on, you have to understand and individuate the relations of production in that society. You have to look at the productive forces. You have to look at their interaction. Right? So that you could do that regardless of whether you think matter is continuous or discontinuous, or whether what is ultimately fundamental is energy or matter, or the content of the concept of matter, right? These seem to be important issues philosophically, but I don't see how they have a direct bearing on the historical materialist approach. Uh, and you could say, well, actually, most of the corpus that we have of historical materialist analysis uh, in economic history and social history is done by people who don't really study uh, uh, the basic sciences and how to interpret the results, right? And they're not really at fault for doing so. Now, of course, when it comes to interpreting, for example, some of the behavioral sciences and the results, I think that's where things become very interesting because it would seem that cognitive science should have a bearing on the historical materialist approach. And the historical materialist approach should have something to say about to cognitive scientists. But that's basically the simple explanation that I just didn't really think I needed to go into that, into the dialectical materialist approach. But the other thing is, to speak very frankly, I don't really have a good understanding of what is the dialectical method, right? I mean, I think if you go back to Hegel, so for example, Hegel would disavow having a dialectical method. I think Hegel would say something like, well, look, dialectics is just examining the object that you're concerned with, independently of any presuppositions. Now, the question is whether this is possible. Is presuppositionless thinking possible? But the idea is you look at the unfolding of the object itself, right? But you don't bring a method from outside and kind of apply it to the object. So, to that extent, I'm one of the people who is a bit skeptical about there being a dialectical method, or rather the dialectical method with the definite article. But again, I didn't even think that the skepticism about the existence of such a method um, is something that I needed to go into in the book. But to your point about the relational approach, I mean, I think the relational approach is just the good approach to study anything. So if that's the dialectical method, then I'm a proponent of, right? So in that sense, right? We agree, but yeah, maybe we disagree about the labels. But yeah, the relational approach, I don't really see how I could, I have, this quotation from Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit in the beginning of the book, right? the true is the whole, right? Which I think is basically true. If you want to understand like a particular society, you have to understand its external relations. Yeah, otherwise I don't really see how you could understand it. So I accept that. So that's what I have to say to that, I think excellent question, really. Um,
Yeah, I was very much thinking in terms of what I see performed is a kind of dialectical method in the sense that you recognize that everything is relationally constituted in a totality, and therefore we have to elucidate the relations and situate them in the totality. We can't isolate reified essences and think that the starting point should be something like African consciousness or a unique, isolated phenomenon that has some type of essence to it. Helena, I know you've written a lot on these types of topics and thought a lot about them. Do you want to weigh in on this general conversation, or there's
I
a question or
do.
two from the chat that I can share?
No,
But
I
go ahead.
do. I think that, I mean, Marx and Engels had this idea of opposition to this idea of one basis for science and another for life. And one way of thinking about nature, another way of thinking about society. And, really affirmed in their position on everything that the truth is the whole. You have to think in a continuous way about everything. And I believe that myself. I tend, if I'm explain if I'm talking about the history of Marxism, I use the terminology that, in paraphrasing that the authors that I'm talking about used. But in arguing my own position, I tend to use the word dialectics and dialectical sparingly because I've just seen so much mystification of dialectics. And first from academic Hegelian Marxists, and secondly from a lot of activists who've just kind of memorized a lot of laws of dialectics, like we memorized the answers to the Catholic Catechism when I was in school. And so I try to say what I want to say in a different way. I use terms like interactionist, developmental, processive, integrated levels, and things like this that I think, especially if I'm talking to a non-Marxist audience and trying to make a case for a certain way of thinking, I tend to use different terminology. Um, but that said, I'm a kind of mainstream Marxist on, in terms of what's called dialectical materialism. But I just think there's a lot of mumbo jumbo sometimes in the name of dialectics.
Yeah, those are
Yeah, and if I could just jump on that. Yeah, I mean, I really, the reasons that Helena just adduced, they really move me too. I mean, I think really, if we want this approach to be appealing, we should just give the analysis, and then when people come and say, well, what kind of analysis is this? You can then label it and say this is dialectical analysis, right? Uh, but then I think, and I also totally agree with, and it didn't come up in the book because there wasn't, something that is directly uh, uh, that had a bearing on the content of the book. But I think one of Helena's really important contributions is her critique of, this kind of I think Helena, you called it the anti-Angles cottage industry or something like that, which you were alluding to in your answer. So I think this attempt to split between the evil Angles who studies the natural sciences and Marx who's cute and does humanistic stuff, I think that's totally fallacious. I just wanted to put that on record that I'm not part of the anti-Angles cottage industry.
wonderful. Yeah, I agree also that there's dialectics has used to, introduce very high levels of sophism. But at the same time, if we understand it in terms of, approaching the world relationally, thinking the totality, seeing the connections, not reifying entities, like at the end of the day, there's a method that's referred to as dialectics that happens to be integral to the tradition that we all identify with. So let's own the concept, but I agree wholeheartedly that the most important thing is to do the analysis, and the terminology is second to that. I thought I would synthesize, Ziad, for you a few questions that were raised, in particular by Khadija Haynes, and apologies if I mispronounced your name. but there were questions, and you can take this in the direction that you want, concerning the destructive or constructive contributions of certain traditions that have been identified as quote unquote, elements of the Black radical tradition or something along those lines. So Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, or as some people call it, Black anti-Marxism, is one of those books, but then also the tradition of Afro-pessimism. There's a very broad industry, particularly within the US context, for focusing on the specificity of Black thinking or Black thought. And Afro-pessimism and the traditions coming out of Cedric Robinson would just be two examples of that, but there are others. And I'm curious, or I take it this is the core of the question, how your work relates to these types of approaches.
Okay, this is a great question. So I have a lot to say about Cedric Robinson in particular. I actually have a forthcoming paper that's a critique of his book, The Black Radical Tradition. So it should be coming out like in the journal Rethinking Marxism pretty soon. But I will say, I actually think that Cedric Robinson, I'm just gonna focus on the book because I also don't want to make general claims about things that I'm not qualified to speak of. I mean, I read some of the Afro-pessimist writings. I think those are different, related but different traditions. But I'll just talk about, the content of the book. I mean, one very interesting thing you notice when you look at the book is that, as I argue in this forthcoming article, it's really a kind of restatement of the methodological orientation of ethnophilosophy. What do I mean by that, right? Where he says, at some point he wants to say, look, the reason why the intellectual content of the Black radical tradition is so different from, the Marxist tradition or something like that, is it draws on what he calls a kind of African metaphysics or African philosophy. And he actually, he doesn't really tell us, what's the content of that philosophy. But the idea is that there is some kind of African philosophy which is shared essentially, it seems, by Africans and their descendants, and it goes with enslaved peoples to the New World and so on, and then it forms the basis for the Black radical tradition, along with the synthesis, of course, of some of the Marxist strands. I think this is basically just pure ethnophilosophy, and all of the criticisms that Hountondji levels at ethnophilosophy can be leveled at Cedric Robinson. And the other thing I would say too, with respect to the particular book or the book itself, is that there is a kind of universalization of the ethno-philosophical approach, because now there isn't just one African philosophy, but there is apparently also one kind of European philosophy, which is the expression of the intellectual essence of Western civilization, because he uses that concept, Western civilization, as an analytic category. So when he tries to explain racism, he actually goes back to some essence of Western civilization. So that's why he does all of the stuff emphasizing the importance of Aristotle. And I mean, in my paper, I go into the details of why this account is not correct, really, just empirically. But there are passages where he says, well, look, actually, Darwin's theory of evolution by means of natural selection, Hegel's dialectics, Marx and Engels' historical and dialectical materialism, Spencer's philosophy are all expressions of the same thing. So now you're basically getting an ethno-philosophy of the West as well. So I think that's basically what's going on there. I think it's very far away from historical materialism. That would just be my position on this. With respect to, I'll just say maybe something about the Afro-pessimist direction, specifically Wilderson's work, because that's the, person I've read a little bit. And again, it seems to me, again, it's in a sense, a complete surrender to an existing state of affairs that came about through the defeat of these progressivist movements, both at the world historical level, so like taking, the Bandung moment until the 1980s, but also in the United States as well. All of the movements of the 60s and 70s, which were defeated and then in part also assimilated into academia. So I think that's really, that should be the context for talking about this stuff. And I'll stop there because I don't want to rant, but I think it's a very good question.
Well, I look forward to reading the forthcoming piece on Robinson. I believe that Cedric Johnson's actually also working on parallel themes and is going to do an event with Jennifer Ponce de Leon for the workshop on critiques of Cedric Robinson. And I actually consider these critiques to be some of the most important, given how widespread this ethno-philosophical or culturalist essentializing approach has become as a forthright attack on historical and dialectical materialism. So very much look forward to reading you on that front. Benjamin Schoendorf asked, if the West has lost technological supremacy, does rejecting science because it is Western, serve the survival of empire? Does that make sense? So if the West has lost, yeah.
Yeah, sorry. So if the West has lost technological supremacy, what's the second part?
Does rejecting science because it is Western serve the survival of empire?
I see, I see. Okay. So, I mean, one way, right, to if I've understood the question is to say, well, look, now that there is a possibility, a very concrete possibility of catching up in some domains, and actually this has been done by China in particular domains, including clean energy, including the defense industry, these supersonic missiles and so on. I don't know if we're allowed to talk about missiles, but anyway, it's kind of important. Uh, but yeah, obviously, in that case, you could say an approach that says, well, science is somehow essentially imperialist or something like that is really just functionally, regardless. Again, I'm not going to talk about the intentions of the people who propagate this discourse. I cannot be inside their head, but what I can do is look at functionally, how does that discourse work? What does it do basically in a given system? And then it would seem very much to be having this effect where you do reinforce Western supremacy in particular scientific and technological domains. So I would agree with the premise of that question. And I mean, it's interesting that, uh, nobody really gives up on modern science or modern medicine when it's their own kid's life at danger, right? So people will be defending, well, we don't need, modern oncology or something, but nobody, if given the opportunity, would, forsake that. And even people who have propagated this kind of discourse, including some African leaders, when they're really sick, they go to Western hospitals. They fly to Europe. I mean, this is a bit of an ad hominem attack, but I think it's relevant. Yeah. So I'm also curious what Helena thinks of this question as well.
Yeah, precisely. Helena, do you have some thoughts you'd like to
Yeah,
share?
I think a negative attitude to science does serve empire. But the interesting thing that's happening now is a virulent attack on science is coming within the empire itself. Capitalism is eating itself, which is already evident before the second Trump administration, but it's on overdrive now. The most virulent anti-science movement is MAGA. And meanwhile, China is soaring ahead on one front after another. I mean, every day as I scroll through my social media, and the news of the day, there's just one thing after another where China's advanced in this and that and the other thing, in clean energy and medicine and all kinds of things. Um, and the US is going to fall ever further behind. Um, and this is a dynamic within capitalism itself, and it's not something that could be solved by electing an alternative administration either. Who the alternative administration in the US would have a different attitude to science and try to undo some of the damage that the Trump administration has done. But there's a deeper dynamic going on there within the decline of capitalism itself. But I think this needs a lot of attention and analysis.
Well, I hope we'll have future opportunities to continue this analysis because the work that both of you are doing is really so important. I know there were a few other general comments and questions online, but hopefully we've gotten to the core of them. Maybe kind of as we wrap, Ziad, if there's any final comments you'd like to share, or Helena?
No, I think we've covered a lot of ground.
Wonderful, wonderful.
Yeah,
Ziad?
I think we had a very interesting discussion, and yeah, maybe just a very pragmatic comment or note. You know, the book is very expensive, but if anyone wants a copy, they can email me and I'll send a copy because it is obscenely expensive. Don't buy my book. Email me.
This is a funny conclusion to the book launch. I did the link to the book is in the chat, and hopefully we'll be able to negotiate with Ziad so that with the Critical Theory Workshop, as many people know, we have two book series, and one of them is with Brill that has expensive volumes for the first year, but then paperback editions come out a year later with Isker books that are highly affordable. So while we're off the call, I'll work on seeing if we can get your next book with us so that people can get it much more at a much more affordable rate. But we'll wrap here. Thank you, everyone online, for joining. Thank you to both of our speakers, and have a wonderful day, and we'll see you soon. Take care. All right. Great. I thought that was wonderful. We're offline now, just so
Yeah.
that you know.